All right, and now that that's all out of the way, a little just intro to who we are. My name's Ella. I use she, her pronouns. I've been organizing with Sunrise Boston for about a year, but I'm currently back home in New Jersey, and I'll pass it to Nick to introduce himself.
Hey everybody, thanks Ella. I'm Nick, I use he, him pronouns. I've been organizing with Sunrise for about a year as well, and I'm hanging out in Somerville. And I'll pass it to Tyler.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler Rivera. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a climate justice organizer with the Boston Student Advisory Council. And I am based here in Boston. I'm going to pass it to Aria.
Hey everyone, I hope everyone's doing well. My name's Aria Ilias. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an alumni advisor with the Boston Student Advisory Council. And I am based in Boston right now, still Boston.
Great, thank you guys. And if you just hopped on this call recently, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. We have 36 people on the call right now, which is super exciting. All right, and just some requests for you guys. We ask that you be present and limit distractions. I know video calls are very different from in-person workshops, as we've all experienced over the past couple of weeks. It's hard to stay focused when there are so many distractions in our lives. So we ask that you close other windows that you might have, put your phone to the side, just make sure that you can really be present because we have some great content for you guys. And make sure to use the chat, especially because webinars can be kind of weird. We can't see your faces. I'd love for people to just use the chat to make this feel a little less anonymous. Feel free, if there's something you really resonate with, you can put a plus sign in the chat to show that you agree with that, or that's something that you're really feeling. Feel free to share any comments or questions in the chat as well. We're going to have a section near the end to answer some of those questions. Yeah. All right. And then just a brief outline of the day or of this workshop, and then we'll get into a short history lesson. So it's going to be from 12 to 2 p.m. This is the introduction right now, obviously. And next we're going to have Nick do a short history lesson on how we got to this current political moment. We're going to talk about the Green New Deal, what's in it, just sort of the three main pillars of the Green New Deal and why they're important. And then we're going to go into a brief power hour. So basically what this is, we're doing this every hour throughout the day, where 10 minutes of every hour will be spent doing some sort of action. So some of them are calling representatives, signing petitions, and we'll get more into that later. But that'll be a nice way to break up what we're doing. And then we're going to have Tyler and Aria talk about what the Green New Deal means in Massachusetts and talk about some of the awesome work that's going on to formulate Green New Deal for the state of Massachusetts. And then I'm gonna close this out by just giving a brief spiel on why we use social movements and why they're important for this moment, how we're organizing in the moment of coronavirus, and just direct us to the next workshop. So again, thank you guys so much for joining us, and I'm gonna kick it off to Nick to get us started.
Cool. Thanks, Ella. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you all about sort of how we got here. So it's important to sort of look to the past as we analyze what we're doing right now, if we're to sort of figure out how to go forward. So let's just start off by taking sort of, a look at the times that we live in right now. Things are a little crazy, right? So we're in April 2020, and we have a handful of things that are kind of on our minds a lot. So we live in a society that is plagued by vast income inequality. We hear about it all the time. Occupy Wall Street sort of coined the 1%. Senator Sanders talks about the 1% of the 1%. So suffice to say, there's a big issue with the distribution of wealth in this country. We also are currently in a period of economic turmoil. These do happen periodically, but with the coronavirus and the COVID pandemic, we happen to be sort of in a scary moment where things are not really looking so good economy-wise, and a lot of people are out of jobs and pretty precarious. We also see the rise of fascist politics. So political figures kind of take these moments to prey on the fear and uncertainty that are surrounding our conditions. And we've seen across the globe that leaders who sort of play this fear-based politics have been able to take positions of power. And if the sort of demonstrations and rallies across the country aren't the perfect example of that, then I'm not sure what is. We also see an increased sense of nationalism, right? Sort of cooperation is breaking down a little bit in these times, especially with COVID. You know, the United States has sort of been not wanting to cooperate with the rest of the world, sort of attacking the World Health Organization, not using the tests from Germany, but wanting to manufacture US-centric tests. And it's hard because people are scared, so we want to protect what is like immediate to us, what's here. Of course, we see environmental degradation. You know, that's what we're talking about all day today for Earth Day. We're in this moment where the climate crisis is building, and we've seen awful natural disasters hitting this country and all across the world, having really widespread effects. And finally, in this moment, we are in a time of pandemic, which is wild. You know, we're all doing everything as virtually as we can. A lot of folks are having, you know, to deal with different stressors related to work, related to family, related to all aspects of life. And it's very pervasive. So suffice to say, April 2020 is pretty rough. And there are a lot of difficult things that face how we have to act in these times. But we can actually look back to an earlier period in our country's history and actually ask ourselves, like, okay, have we seen this before? And the result is kind of surprising. So when we look way back about 100 years ago, we see, okay, there was a period of very vast income inequality. You know, when we learn about it in school, it's called the robber baron era, right? These are folks who sort of monopolized their industries when it was steel and oil back in the day. And we can apply that to our times. There was economic turmoil. This is, you know, kind of scary, but a lot of people are hearkening back to the Great Depression to sort of say that a lot of our times are similar. We see the rise of fascist politics as well. We saw nationalism sort of leading into the world wars. We saw environmental degradation in the Dust Bowl, and we also had a pandemic. You know, people are talking about Spanish flu, which is what people call it, which I think is a bad name because it's kind of like the Chinese virus, but the flu of 1918 infected millions of people around the world. So things are kind of rough, but we actually have seen a lot of very like weirdly similar things before, right? Like, what the heck? This is really, really similar. So this is a good indication that we can look back to sort of see what we can do, what we've done to get out of similar situations and what we can do now. So in a really, really brief nutshell, we can sort of paint a picture of the history of this country. Now, I made this curve, and it roughly corresponds to economic prosperity, with the caveat that it's not for all people, but it's sort of a marker of how things have gone throughout our country's history. So if we sort of start the timeline at the 20s, you know, we're coming out of this period of prosperity for some folks, but not a lot of folks. And the curve kind of, you know, goes up and then goes quite down. And we call that the Great Depression, right? Economic times were really bad. And then something that started to get us out of the Depression when things were the worst, we talk a lot about the New Deal. So I'll get into some of the specifics of the New Deal in a second, but suffice to say, it sort of starts to move us up along this path, right? Where we're at the lowest point and we needed to do something to get the country back on track. But it didn't get us all the way out of these sort of economic crises and social crises. So when the US actually entered the Second World War in 1941, that kicked the economy and the social conditions back into a period where we actually saw a ton of prosperity in the country. And again, it wasn't for all people, right? We still lived in a very sexist and a very racist, white supremacist culture, such that a lot of the benefits went to white people and went to men. But our World War II mobilization actually expanded the economy and created what people say is like the middle class as we know it. So we can call that the World War II mobilization and the ensuing economic boom. So things kind of continued like that for a while, and a lot of sort of social policies progressed along that time frame. And we can kind of mark 1968 as a year that a lot of people reference as sort of the height of movements, right? There's big anti-war movement for the war in Vietnam. There were tons of student protests. That was, a time of really great feminist movement. There was a time of gay rights movement, and we saw just a lot of social activity. People were sort of taking their fate into their own hands in a lot of way. But then, as you can kind of see, we came from this moment and we get the beginning of this weird up and down decline. So we can kind of pinpoint a starting point in 1961 with the election of President Reagan. So this sort of kicked off a shift in ideology where instead of kind of looking towards the government to do policies like the New Deal or the World War II mobilization, we kind of shifted towards what a lot of people call the neoliberal period. And I know that's kind of like, it can be a confusing word that's used a lot of different ways, but in general, it kind of like was the shift towards using racism in politics, towards, talking more about these like family values, using the Cold War as sort of like a looming enemy to take away rights that people fought for. And on the economic side, a lot of deregulation, right? Like where we saw a lot of environmental legislation passed in the 60s and 70s that was sort of started to scale back under this neoliberal kind of like Reagan-esque and Margaret Thatcher move. And then we can also pinpoint 2008. Most recent in a lot of our memories, we had the financial crisis, which was sort of, kicked off by over-speculation in the mortgage market. And that kind of brought us the Great Recession, and that brings us to now, when we're facing the COVID pandemic. So in a nutshell, this is a very compressed view of our history, but in general, it's kind of like, okay, things got pretty bad, right? When we came into the Depression, it was really rough. But then things got better. And like I said, for many people, but not all people, but for a significant portion of people. And then they got bad and they're still kind of bad again, because we listed a ton of problems at the start. So it begs the question, why? Why did things sort of go down and then up and then down again? And I sort of already gave it away, but we can identify some really key things in our history that sort of lent themselves to these rises and falls. So first, the New Deal. Why did the New Deal sort of kick us out of the Depression and start to really put us back on track? Part of the New Deal was a ton of public works projects, right? So this created a lot of bridges, a lot of dams. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created under the New Deal, which put electricity in the hands of communities who hadn't been hooked up before. We had a lot of guarantees on workers' rights, so the right to collectively bargain, the right to, this was a period of really intense strikes, so workers' rights were guaranteed under the New Deal. The New Deal saw that a big part of the issue was that banks were over-speculating, so there was a lot of regulation on big banks. And then finally, we saw social safety measures like the Social Security Act passed under the New Deal, which is sort of to say, people didn't have a lot of money, people didn't have a lot of resources, we really need to take care of people, right? And I also sort of pinpointed us entering World War II. So this has been thrown around in recent times. The Defense Production Act, which is actually the Korean War Act, but was sort of started in the World War II era, was the government took control of things and said, hey, we have to produce things for the war effort. And that created a lot of economic prosperity, a lot of jobs for people. So it created mass employment. We also had the GI Bill. So people who went to serve overseas got access to education where they may not have had access to that previously. And finally, we even had things in this era like a 94% top income tax rate. That was considered just normal. It was part of the thing that war is expensive, we need to pay for it somehow. So, we had very high taxes. And then, why did things sort of start to change? I alluded to this earlier. There's a lot of deregulation under the neoliberal period, this sort of idea of trickle-down economics that we hear. A huge anti-government sentiment. Reagan is famous for saying the biggest problem is government itself, right? Thatcher is really big on society is just a collection of individuals, there is no government. I hope I can go back. Yeah, and it's important to sort of note that when we take a look at the things that really got us out of a bad place, it's not necessarily a lot of the politics that we hear about now where it's corporations need to be helped, right? All day we're going to talk about the people's bailout and sort of the idea that in this time of pandemic, it's getting down to the wire, and instead of doing the things that help corporations that actually led to a lot of this decline from 1981 onward, we really need to just put resources in the hands of people and help normal people. That's what the New Deal and the World War II mobilization did in a big way that seems just undoable to us. So if we squish it, we're in the COVID pandemic, and we obviously want to get back to this upswing, right? We need to do something to get us out of this crisis, and we need to do something drastic, and we should take a look at our history, right? So that's why we call for things like the people's bailout, because that, like our history, puts resources and money into the hands of actual people. It gives people jobs. It starts having people care about each other again. And that's why we also call for a Green New Deal. So it's, aptly named after the original New Deal. We think there are a lot of good things that the New Deal did, although it had problems. So we need really a better New Deal, a new deal. And we'll talk more about that later. So in a nutshell, that's why we're here and how we got here. Okay, so I know that was a lot. So take just a couple minutes. I know I'm gonna take it because I think I need to take a stretch break for my mouth because I think I said too many things. Yeah, it's hard because we're really not sort of all in the same place together. But I think it's important, even though we're all sort of together virtually, to do these small things, right? And take the time for ourselves to sort of, move around. If you're sitting in a chair like I am, kind of stretch out to the side, just take a second to reground yourself in your space. I'll crack my back. I don't know if you can hear it. Thanks, everybody. Okay, hopefully you're a little loosened up now, a little stretched out. It's time to go back into what we do. So where do we go from here? So let's talk about the Green New Deal. So in general, when we're talking about the Green New Deal, what are we even talking about? What is the Green New Deal, right? And as a lot of you may know, sort of on paper, it's a congressional resolution, right, that was introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, AOC, we love her, in the House. and Senator Ed Markey. Shout out to Ed Markey. Come see him at our rally later today in the Senate early last year. So just over a year ago. It is a 14-page, and I say very readable because I encourage you to read it. The font is enormous. I don't know why they make it that big, but it's a very readable outline of policy goals that we know are necessary to fight the climate crisis in a just way that really does it in this New Deal fashion of giving power back to people to fight this. And in the time that's passed since it's been over a year, it's really an agenda that's been fleshed out by a lot of notable Democratic policymakers. So first, Jay Inslee took a crack at it and released this like huge implementation plan for it. He actually just resurrected it for a version that would address a lot of the issues we see in the COVID pandemic crisis. I think it's called the Evergreen Plan. I would definitely recommend reading that. We also saw sort of Green New Deal implementations from the Sanders campaign, from the Warren campaign, and many others. And notably, when we had a lot of Democratic presidential contenders, movements pushed all of these folks to endorse the Green New Deal and make it part of their campaign platforms. So it's evolved a lot over the year. And okay, that was pretty vague. So yeah, but like, what is it? What actually is the Green New Deal? So this is still a little general, but we're honing in a bit, right? It's a national mobilization at the scope and scale necessary to stop the climate crisis. The climate crisis is at a scope and scale that is, well, very big and very scary. So we need something equally big to really start to address it in a meaningful way. And in that sense, it's a rejection, right, of this like narrative that we've had for so long of individual responsibility, right? Like this sort of comes back to the Reaganites, right? To like these neoliberal ideas that if something is wrong, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and fix it yourself. You know, we're in a climate crisis, you better recycle, you better compost, you better stop eating meat. And you know, these are things that some people can do and are important and would move the needle, but it's not the only way to address this. Oh, I think we had a question. Hold on. Oh yeah, so really quick to Laura. The measurement for the y-axis was a very, very rough indication of economic prosperity, right? So, and I would say for average people, you know, if you want to map the economic prosperity of the 1%, it just kind of keeps going up, which is wild. But the graph is sort of like overall goodness for normal people. And then finally, the Green New Deal is very importantly a vision of justice, right? So we've had so many decades where things have been left by the wayside, right? And it's a really emphatic declaration that things cannot go on the way they've been going on anymore, and that we really, really need to change the way our country views itself and how we view our values. So I think, Ella, do you want to snag this part? Oh, Ella, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, so now that we've gone through some of the overarching values of the Green New Deal, we'll talk a little bit more about what we call the 3 pillars of the Green New Deal. The first of those is 100% renewable energy by 2030. This is just recognizing that we need to make really drastic, significant changes to our energy infrastructure in order to prevent the most catastrophic effects of climate change based on the IPCC report that came out, I think it was in 2017 or 2018, saying that like it was a matter of 10 years that we had to cut global carbon emissions in half before the worst effects of climate change become unavoidable. The second pillar is millions of good jobs. So it's providing this economic stimulus that the original New Deal did, although the New Deal, when it provided jobs, it often had really problematic quotas and wasn't providing jobs to all people. For example, there was like a limit on how many Black men could take a certain amount of the jobs. So this is what's involved in this pillar is a federal jobs guarantee, recognizing that in order to turn over the infrastructure of our country to renewable energy, this is going to require a lot of jobs. And that's coinciding in an era where there are less jobs in the fossil fuel industry than ever before. They're rapidly declining, and tons of people are left out of work. We need to bring along all those people in the transition to renewable energy. And then the third pillar is prioritization of frontline communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but in essence, this is looking at how marginalized people are disproportionately affected by climate change. And in a similar way to what we're seeing with the COVID crisis, these moments of crisis exacerbate existing inequalities, and we need to actively address those inequalities in order to bring along our whole country to along in a Green New Deal and in this transition to renewable energy. Yeah, so the first pillar again is 100% renewable energy. Now, some of the more details of what this entails: revamping infrastructure, schools, houses, apartments, offices. We need to retrofit buildings, which means basically taking our existing energy infrastructure in these buildings, especially in public buildings, which account for a huge amount of carbon emissions, and making sure that they run on renewable energy and are really energy efficient. Giving federal grants to states and municipalities to rebuild to top efficiency standards is going to take a lot of funding, and we need that to come from a federal level. New and affordable public transportation. The transportation sector is a huge source of carbon emissions, and this is a really important area to decrease carbon emissions. So this does two things. Not only does it decarbonize this huge sector of our economy, but transportation is one of the biggest determinants of social mobility. And by making public transportation affordable and higher quality, we can just really help bring along working people in this transition. And then alternative transnational transportation other than air travel, high-speed rail. Recognizing that air travel is this huge source, again, of carbon emissions, and by making different alternatives, like a transnational transportation system, like a high-speed rail, we can really just take a lot of carbon, just decrease a lot of carbon emissions. So this is another really important area. Also, one of the most common critiques of the Green New Deal: we're not trying to ban planes, but just it's so ridiculous. But incentivizing different forms of transportation can be hugely beneficial. Increasing our national electric grid using solar panels, wind turbines, water, and geothermal. Those need to go into a smart grid technology and make sure that we have a national grid of renewable energy. And then regenerative agriculture. This is really important. Agriculture is one of the few ways we have that we can actually sequester carbon from the air and put it back in the ground. So we need to invest in agricultural systems, in small farming and regenerative farming practices that will actually take carbon out of the air in a really big way. And bans on fracking and new drilling projects. This is a really important one. Also an element with justice, because fracking and new drilling projects are often put in minority neighborhoods, and we need to ban all new drilling projects and be moving towards renewable energy. and then cooperation with Global South to assist in transition. There have been pieces, there have been things like the Red Deal, which was introduced to sort of expand on the Green New Deal and highlight how we need to be working with the Global South in assisting this transition, recognizing that like we all need to be a part of this together, and that the United States has a disproportionate role in global carbon emissions. Yeah, is there anything else you want to add there, Nick?
No.
Oh wait, 1 second. The presentation.
I think I did that. My bad.
1 second. Let me just pull that back up.
I'm a Zoom noob. Don't hate me.
It's very confusing. Okay, I think that should do it. Oh, although I might need to click through it again. All right, just a little review, all these points again.
Totally. Cool.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we also know pillar number 2 was that, yeah, we need millions of good jobs, right? So this stuff is not going to really happen by itself. And in the job creation, we really need to center justice, right? In a way that, like Ella said, in the New Deal was actually not really present. And even in the World War II mobilization was not present. So the first thing that Ella already sort of talked about is that the Green New Deal calls for a federal jobs guarantee. So that literally means that every single person in the country would be able to get a job from the government. And there's a lot of economic theory behind this. Some people criticize this and say it would be hyperinflationary. A lot of economists think no. There's a longer discussion to be had about that. And if you have questions, maybe, I don't know, we can answer them later. But suffice to say, that's a part of justice. Everyone deserves a job. A lot of the Green New Deal is about reframing rights, and we think people should have a right to a livable wage, good job. So that's the second part, right? Like these jobs shouldn't just be crappy jobs, right? They should be high wage, unionized jobs. And we know they need to be both building infrastructure and restoring ecosystems. So Ella was talking about the regenerative agricultural piece of this. It's not just enough to build turbines, to build solar panels. We actually need to restore our wetlands. We need to engage in new agricultural practices and maybe even do so much as depave some cities and sort of revamp what our residential spaces look like. The Green New Deal calls for Medicare for all because while people are transitioning out of their jobs, it's insane that they wouldn't have healthcare, right? The fact that healthcare is tied up into us having a job is nuts, especially when we're the wealthiest country in the history of humanity. So it just makes sense that while people have to transition from sector to sector, which notably is something that will always happen, people should not have to lose their health insurance. The Green New Deal also calls for, yeah, some cooperation between public and private industry, but with the caveat that it's not just that like taxes and stuff finance huge profits for corporations. The money needs to go back to the people, like we were talking about in the New Deal legislation in the World War II mobilization, to really build up that economic prosperity that's been missing from this country for so long. It calls for hiring equitably. And that really means that we need to take a hard look at how easy it is for some people to get jobs and how hard it is for a lot of people to get jobs. And there are a lot of standards that can be enforced federally that states would be be audited and have to comply with while they're hiring for these jobs from the jobs guarantee. And it's not really just that we need to build infrastructure and restore ecosystems. There's also this burgeoning economy that a lot of people talk about called the care economy. And these are what we talk about when we say green jobs, right? So there's sort of a deficit, and COVID has really made this palpable in our minds. There's a deficit in these like caring jobs, but they actually support our like entire society. And they're simultaneously like the most underfunded jobs in our culture, and often least respected. But jobs like teaching, nursing, elder care, childcare, these are so important to what sociologists call it social reproduction. But just think about it like you just need to like keep society running. So of course we need teachers and nurses and elder care and childcare, but they should have high wage, good jobs with unions that the federal government can actually provide these and make these a lot better. It includes federal funding for the arts, right? You don't just need to be making tech. The New Deal actually provided a lot of funding for the arts, which led to a lot of prosperity. We need more research and development, obviously, to make these technologies even better and to keep looking into the reasons why we're in the crisis and how we can get out of it. And then it also calls for universal public education in college, because it's nuts that we pay so much. Student debt is like a huge crisis that's just sort of waiting to hit us someday. And sort of like the GI Bill, people being able to go to college who wouldn't have been able to get an education otherwise really created a lot of prosperity in the country.
And then the last pillar, as we see it, is the prioritization of frontline communities. So as I sort of touched on before, like at the core of the Green New Deal is this idea that we can't address climate change without addressing racism and economic inequality. They're all deeply intertwined, and to address one without the other is to like not bring everyone along in this transition and to reproduce the same systems of inequality that brought us into this crisis. So we define frontline communities here as groups that disproportionately face the effects of climate change. Typically, these include Indigenous people, people of color, especially Black and Brown folks, and disabled folks, among other groups. We know that crises exacerbate existing inequalities. And again, we're seeing this so much with coronavirus. People at the beginning were calling it the great equalizer because everybody, like anyone can get the coronavirus, but in fact, what we're seeing is that's not even by a long shot true. We're seeing that Black communities are disproportionately facing the impacts of coronavirus, with Black people having a disproportionate amount of cases and deaths from COVID, despite the fact that they make up around 19% of the general population. We're seeing those statistics come forward in a lot of states as the situation progresses. So it is really, really crucial that frontline communities are prioritized in the Green New Deal. And what this looks like is a bunch of different things. For example, recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. This is hugely, hugely important. Indigenous people have had this land for far longer than us, and it is important that we recognize the sovereignty when considering any new projects. Asking for advice and knowledge from Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have lived in harmony with this land for centuries, and we need to be calling in Indigenous people, asking for support, advice, and knowledge in building this new economy. Recognizing environmental justice issues actually have disproportionate effects on marginalized communities. Prioritizing issues of clean air, water, and infrastructure for environmental justice communities. Recognizing, as I said, that like new fossil fuel projects are often placed disproportionately in poor, low-income neighborhoods, in Black and Brown neighborhoods, and that clean air, water have suffered because of this. Prioritizing grants to marginalized communities to kickstart Green New Deal projects. Again, just like putting prioritization of these communities at the front of these new efforts. We have like, when we're kickstarting these new projects, we have an opportunity to call people in and to work against these centuries of inequality. democratic community level control of new energy infrastructure. Nick talked about this a little bit with the original New Deal, and it's a really important piece, making sure that communities actually have the ability to choose whether or not new energy infrastructure is placed in their communities, and that it's controlled at a community level. Decriminalizing migration and immigration and paths to citizenship. So we know that with the climate crisis, there are tons more immigrants coming into our country. We know that climate refugees are going to increase as natural disasters continue to ravage different parts of the world, as farming economies suffer, especially in the global south. Like we see more and more climate refugees every year, and we need to make sure that we have actually just immigration policies in effect to welcome immigrants into our country, especially in these scenarios where it's exacerbated by the climate crisis, and recognizing how those two things intersect. Yeah, so that was a whole bunch of information. We would love for people to share in the chat, like what are some of the most exciting parts? What are the things that you resonate most with about the Green New Deal and are excited to fight for?
Can't wait to see.
Yeah, 100% renewable energy.
For sure. And so soon.
Prioritizing care economy, Medicare for all, good jobs for
Mhm.
better and cleaner technology, high-speed rail. Yeah,
Hell yeah. I'd be there for high-speed rail, for sure.
I'm there for
Flying
high-speed rail.
sucks, right?
Yeah, being able to increase equality while helping the climate, creating a new baseline system. Just seeing the situation we're in is like in this moment of crisis, like we actually have such an opportunity to do things better and to rebuild our economy in a way that is more just. Seeking the help of Indigenous people, giving people good jobs, get rid of old harmful technologies, Medicare for all. Yeah. Yeah, all these are great. Thank you guys so much for sharing. And then another question is just what are some of the common critiques you hear about the Green New Deal? Because there are many. And in a way, like I think the right up until now has had a lot of power in shaping the narrative about the Green New Deal, and that's something that we need to really take back.
They have.
Yeah, cost too much is a big one that we've been seeing, and I think in this moment of coronavirus, like it's completely been debunked. I mean, answering this question like a year ago, I feel like I was always like, oh yeah, well in World War II, we were able to just come together as a country, and like when the need arose, like we were able to find the money and come up with it, and like pointing to that really far back example. And now I'm like, oh, remember like all these stimulus bills that were passed like last week, like in the past couple of weeks, and just like it is so clear now that like when our country is in crisis, we come up with the money, and it's like uh, just the question is, are we going to spend that money bailing out big corporations, or are we going to spend that money actually helping working people? But the money is there when we need it to be.
Totally. And with like not realistic or like too ambitious, we hear that all the time. But when you look back at history and we see that we've done similar things, those arguments just dissolve, right? When, like Ella just said, when the circumstances are dire enough, we can find ways to do this. And I think it speaks to like the surprising or maybe unsurprising resilience of people. Like this pandemic has been awful and is just horrifying and terrifying, but people do find ways to adapt. We have like more strength than we think, right? A lot of the times.
Yeah, absolutely. And just recognizing that, like I said, in order to address the climate crisis, we need to address all these types of inequality because they all play into each other. And we're not actually addressing the problem by just transitioning to renewable energy. We're actually making the problem worse and exacerbating existing inequalities.
Sure.
Yeah, I also want to emphasize that the Green New Deal is more than just a single bill. It's more than even just the resolution that was introduced by AOC and Markey. It's a broad governing agenda. All this can't be accomplished and won't be accomplished in a single bill, but this is setting forth just broad guidelines for the next 10 years of legislation.
For sure. And if you want to hear more about one of the more specific bills that's come out of it, make sure to hit up the Green New Deal for Public Housing teach-in. When is that? At 3? I think 3 to 5.
All right, and now it is time for our first power hour. Very exciting. So this power hour is going to be an action towards the like signing a petition to stand with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. So if you haven't heard much about this, in the midst of a literal global pandemic, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is trying to take away the land of the Mashpee Wampanoag and dispossess them from their land. So they've occupied the same region for over 12,000 years. If you live in Boston or if you live in the southeast of Massachusetts, it's likely you are on what was originally their land before it was violently taken away by colonizers. And this tribe has actually only been federally recognized for 13 years, despite having been here for over 12,000. It's held 321 acres of land in trust for only 5 of these years. So now, like I said, the BIA has taken their land out of the trust, threatening their sovereignty in the middle of a global pandemic, undermining the future and sustainability of this nation. This is absolutely absurd and just an incredible injustice, and like just seeing this happen, like them using the pandemic as a distraction, trying to pull their land away, is really awful. So we are gonna use the next couple of minutes to sign a petition that is standing with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and affirming that that this is their land and they should not be removed from it. So
Absolutely.
the link is on the slide, and I can pass it. I can drop it in the chat as well.
And once you fill out the petition, put a little plus in the chat so we see a flurry of pluses and we can see how much support we're putting behind them. And I think they're really close to their goal, which I think is 300,000 signatures. They've gotten a ton so far, so this is really going to help a lot. Look at all those pluses. Amazing. Jess Laborio, a plus. Hi, Jess. Ooh, David says, even better, call your rep as well as Markey and Warren and tell them about this. Absolutely. This is like a huge part of political advocacy that it's weird. We like think we really can't have effects on these things, but if you have time and you have the means to do so, it always helps to bring these items to the attention of our representatives. Otherwise, what are they doing if they're not like listening to us?
Yeah, I'm going to drop the link one more time. And if you haven't had an opportunity to do this yet, please do sign that petition. Super, super, super important. Oh, thanks. Jess is saying it did pass the House, so we don't need to call our reps, but it is held up in the Senate. So definitely write to your representatives, or sorry, not your representatives, your senators. Yeah, please do that.
Thanks, Jess.
Great, so it looks like most folks have had the opportunity to sign that, and I will post it one more time in case you didn't yet, but please, please, please do this. I'm going to pass it to Tyler to take us into the next section.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Nick and Ella, for an incredible overview in only 1 hour of the Green New Deal and why it's so fundamental to creating real progressive change for working people in America. Now, Ariana and I are going to kick off a quick overview of the Massachusetts Green New Deal and what the Boston Student Advisory Council has been doing to make this change possible here in Massachusetts. So we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves, and then I'm going to pass the baton over to Aria to dive into what BSAC is and give us an overview of the Massachusetts Green New Deal. So again, my name is Tyler Rivera, and I am a climate justice organizer with the Boston Student Advisory Council. We like to call it BSAC for short.
And hello, everyone. My name's Aria Ilias. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been a part of the Boston Student Advisory Council for about 2.5 years now, and I'm now an alumni staff member, which is pretty cool. So for some of you guys who are not familiar with BSAC, again, Boston Student Advisory Council, it's a student-led organization that represents Boston Public School students across the district. It's for high school students, and we teach, well, not really teach, but we allow young people to strengthen their skills when it comes to facilitation, public speaking, advocacy, and everything in between. We're within the district, so we make sure that we have as much representation from people of color and young people of color as possible. And we focus on 3 major subcommittee focuses. So the first one we're going to talk about is environmental justice, which is self-explanatory. Making sure to dismantle environmental racism any way that we can, and ensure that youth voice is included in the conversation when it comes to these issues. Student rights and student voice is pretty self-explanatory, but it also has the conversation of making sure students feel comfortable advocating for their rights within the schools, and making sure an administration within all Boston Public Schools respects the young people's voices as much as possible. And then school climate represents, I guess, the overall safety and well-being of the students, making sure that when a student walks into a school, they feel supported both on an emotional level, but also they have the resources necessary to thrive and continue their educational experiences at the same time. So next slide. Okay, so just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to begin with what is the Green New Deal. On a Massachusetts level, we sort of discussed how it would be federally, but of course we are a state that's very different from an overall national level. So we would need to include the values and priorities that the state needs for right now. So we're going to describe that. And we're also going to describe how various different sectors and stuff throughout the state have been implementing the Massachusetts Green New Deal in order to develop policy that would reflect the values of our state. And yeah, so I'll hand it off to Tyler for a little bit.
Thank you, Aria. So in order to set the stage for why Massachusetts needs a Green New Deal, I first wanted to touch on some of the successes and the shortcomings of existing climate legislation in Massachusetts. So when we think about Massachusetts, we often think of our state as being a progressive leader, very similar to states like California, Vermont, and Washington. And these progressive leanings are reflected in the views and perceptions of our state's residents. For example, in Massachusetts, residents express a stronger belief in climate science and stronger support for climate action compared to the US as a whole. So, for example, when asked whether or not they believe if global warming is happening, 67% of US residents say that global warming is happening, compared to 72% of Massachusetts residents. And the same follows for whether or not schools should teach about global warming. 77% of US residents believe they should, whereas 79% of Massachusetts residents believe that schools should teach about global warming. So on the whole, Massachusetts is more progressive when it comes to climate change and climate action than the US. But we also know that popular support for policies doesn't necessarily translate to legislation. And the example that I always like to use is that in the United States, 96% of people believe that universal background checks on gun purchases should be federal law. Yet we still lack any federal legislation mandating universal background checks. So when it comes to climate legislation, let's take a look at what the broad public support for climate action has actually resulted in Massachusetts. So the key piece of legislation for everyone to know is the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008. And I'll call it the GWSA. It created a framework for reducing our state's greenhouse gas emissions compared to the levels that they were in 1990. So by 2020, this year, we were supposed to have reduced emissions by 25% compared to 1990. And by 2050, we were supposed to have reduced emissions by 80%. And some of this may sound familiar to you. It's kind of like the targets that were set out in the Paris Climate Accords. And it's good and it's ambitious, and we definitely want to see significant reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions across the state. The problem with the Global Warming Solutions Act is that it didn't really have any rules or regulations for enforcing how we were going to achieve these ambitious targets. Basically, the state set this lofty goal, but then it didn't really have any real plan for achieving that goal. So, of course, it was young people who recognized this failing. And in 2014, some students from Boston Latin School and Boston College School of Law came together and sued the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and arguing that the department had failed to enact any regulations that would actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. And in 2016, those young people won in the Massachusetts State Supreme Court when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of those young people, saying that the Department of Environmental Protection needed to establish rules on how the state was going to reduce emissions on an annual basis. And then shortly after that, Governor Baker issued an executive order requiring his administration to prepare a comprehensive energy plan for the entire state, and also ordering the Department of Environmental Protection to create and enforce regulations that would reduce our emissions as a state on an annual basis. So, some of you may also be familiar with something that happened actually earlier this year that essentially one-upped what the Global Warming Solutions Act established. So in January of 2020, just a few months ago, Governor Baker announced a new goal for the state of Massachusetts to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the way that he framed this commitment was that we're still going to work towards our goal of reducing emissions by 80% by 2050. But the remaining 20% of emissions that might be left over will need to be basically balanced out through offsets. So that's things like restoring wetlands, restoring forests that take up carbon from the atmosphere, and investing in technologies that would allow us to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that sounds really great, right? Like, we're not only going to be reducing our overall emissions, but we're going to be balancing out whatever emissions we still have by 2050. Well, unfortunately, at the same time that Governor Baker here in Massachusetts is making these lofty commitments to net zero, he's also investing in fossil fuel infrastructure that continues our reliance upon a carbon-based economy. So just a few weeks ago, Governor Baker announced that the construction of the natural gas compressor station in Weymouth was essential. And workers at the Weymouth compressor station site continue to risk their lives, as well as the lives of their family members and the lives of the residents of Weymouth by continuing to construct the compressor station on an ongoing basis through a global pandemic. And we know that by continuing to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, we're not only deepening our attachment to business as usual, carbon-based economy, but we're making it more difficult and more costly to transition to a fossil-free future. So suffice it to say, this is not enough. We recognize the progress that has been made here in Massachusetts, which is, to be honest, a lot more progress that has been made in other states in America. But we know that this progress that we have made, it simply isn't enough. Like Ella referred to earlier, the 2018 IPCC report on climate change made it more than clear that in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is still our target, we're going to need transformative policy solutions and a complete decarbonization of our energy systems and our economy, not just trying to balance out what emissions we do have with offsets while continuing with business as usual. So we believe that Massachusetts needs to set a far more ambitious emissions reduction target that aims to fully decarbonize our state by 2050. No more fossil fuels and no more emissions. And beyond just mitigating the emissions that we do have, we know that we need massive government investment in green jobs and green infrastructure that's going to ensure that the transition to a decarbonized future and economy happens in a really just way, while also focusing on addressing the long-standing racial, economic, environmental, and other social injustices that disproportionately impact working class communities and BIPOC communities. And now I'm going to hand it over to Aria to talk about how this vision ties into the work that we're doing around the Massachusetts Green New Deal.
Thank you, Tyler. So like Tyler said earlier, Massachusetts is very known for being a lot more progressive than the rest of the country. But I guess we also need to understand that even though Massachusetts is very progressive compared to the rest of the country, we also need to make sure that any Green New Deal legislation is very similar to that, so that we can sort of lead the pack when it comes to other states implementing their own Green New Deals and other regions of the country doing the same thing. So in essence, the Massachusetts Green New Deal at a general state is the same three pillars that we discussed at the beginning: decarbonization of our current economy, more investment in green infrastructure and employment opportunities, and addressing the intersecting social justice inequities that come with the crisis. But of course, those are just general terms. We also need to understand that in order to implement those things, we need to make sure that the people who are primarily impacted by the climate crisis or just climate change in general are included in the conversation as well as policy making. So that sort of leads into the next point of slides. The Massachusetts Green New Deal Roundtable. This has been in the works for about a year or so now, but it's an entire team dedicated to developing a Green New Deal policy or piece of legislation that would reflect both the values of the Green New Deal and the values of the state of Massachusetts. Again, we have to ensure that the communities that are primarily affected by this are included in the conversation. So when talking about employment from earlier, we need to make sure that the labor union members, the ones that had jobs that were sort of implementing to sort of the negative effects of the climate crisis, they're being trained in the same field that they're in, but only implementing cleaner energy within those. So making sure we have labor union members in that conversation, environmental justice organizers, people that have been dedicated to the work for a very long time and still need to implement their values and support that they've been implementing within their own communities. They also need to be included in the conversation, so that, and policy making overall, so that it reflects the actual environmental justice at like a narrow perspective within communities. And then of course, young people and young people of color. We can see this with other historical movements like the civil rights movement or just any movement in general. Young people are at the forefront of this movement. They're the most powerful and they're the future of it. And that's the only way that things are going to be implemented, is if young people are involved. BSAC being a primary example of that. So making sure that young people's voices are not only heard, but you hear the opinions and you're also implementing their values and choices into legislation. So we have those 3 pillars and 3 sectors per se included in this roundtable, so that there's representation from all aspects of life and all aspects of experiences. Even though these are different, we're all at this roundtable, that doesn't necessarily mean that we all agree with the same things and that we're all on the same page when it comes to these experiences and also policy. So cross-sector communication is really important within this group, and we try to ensure that, sure, we might not be on the same page when it comes to separate issues, but when it comes to the climate crisis and implementing something that represents all of us, that we can develop legislation that reflects that. And we hope to have that done for the 2021 legislative session. And
Thank you, Anna.
yeah.
So where is the Massachusetts Green New Deal going from here? Well, at this moment, in the middle of both a public health crisis and an economic downturn, we're seeing that the deep and systemic injustices in our society and our economy are being revealed. And for many of us, we were already well aware of them, but for people who weren't, they're just now having their eyes open to see how deeply unjust our world has been for a long time now. And we're seeing that millions of people now lack access to healthcare because they've lost their jobs. We've seen that frontline workers who have been deemed essential right now are grocery workers, our delivery workers, nurses, home healthcare workers. They're overwhelmingly people of color who are earning low wages and lack benefits like paid sick leave or family leave. We're seeing that the same communities who spend 50, 60, 70% of their incomes on rent are being laid off by the millions and are having to choose between whether or not to put a roof over their families' heads, whether or not to put food in the refrigerator, whether or not to put gas in the tank so that they can continue to go to work. And at the end of the day, we're finding that our extractive economy, it's leaving far too many people vulnerable. And it's destroying our planet's life support systems. And ultimately, it's concentrating wealth and concentrating power in the hands of a select few people who are able to shield themselves from the impacts of this crisis and who will be able to shield themselves from the impacts of the climate crisis. And this is deeply unjust. So in looking for how we're going to transition ourselves forward into a just economy and a regenerative economy, we know that we desperately need a complete system reboot, something like what the Green New Deal calls for, in order to transform our unsustainable economy into one that supports the health and well-being of ecosystems and of communities, one that puts power over resources into working people's hands, one that centers the needs of communities who have been hurt worst by this crisis and who will be hurt worst by the climate crisis, and fundamentally, one that is built on love, one that's built on care, and one that is built on compassion. We know that our vision for what a just transition should look like, it needs to be built by real people. And everyday people who are a part of the Green New Deal Roundtable here in Massachusetts are helping to shape the decisions that are ultimately going to affect their lives and the lives of their families and their communities disproportionately. And this is exactly the kind of movement building that Ella's going to talk about in a little bit, and that we really need to engage in right now in order to build and sustain the long-term power that we're going to need to win a progressive agenda. It's not just about this year, it's not just about this election cycle, it's about winning real progressive change. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is by sharing space together, by listening to one another, and by working in solidarity across our sectors in order to build power collectively and exercise it. So we know that the climate crisis, it's far too urgent to wait for solutions to be handed down to us. We need to seize control of our futures and do what's right for people and do what's right for our planet. And I fundamentally believe that when we act together and when we act collectively, we are unstoppable. And now we're going to hear from some young people who've been involved in this movement and in our work to make a Green New Deal possible here in Massachusetts. Some members of our Boston Student Advisory Council. So I'm going to kick it over to Adam, who's going to start by sharing his experience.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? My name's Adam. I'm a college student and alumni of Boston Student Advisory Council, as well as Youth on Board. And for me, getting to be on the panel, or getting to like be at the table to talk about creating the Massachusetts Green New Deal has honestly been a little bit scary. Like, it kind of feels intense to be a young person, to be able to be at the table with all these adults, being able to make these decisions that I think often young people feel like these decisions, like they feel powerless in making these decisions. These decisions seem like way too big, way too far over their head. But it's been like really good to try and train myself and to work with other young people at the table to really feel comfortable, to work with these adults, to feel like we actually have a really important role in the decision-making process. And I think it's been really cool because I've seen so many young people like bring out these brilliant ideas that adults at the table just hadn't necessarily thought of before, because we bring such a unique perspective to the table. And I think so often that's overlooked, and so often young people overlook that in themselves. We need to remember as young people, and especially like really encouraging young people of color, that we need to come to the forefront, that we need to like be at the front of this fight, that our opinion is like actually really special, that we have something like so interesting to bring to the table. And like, yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what I've learned, is just like that this is our fight, this is like our future. That's why it's so important for me. And I think we just need to continue to push young people forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Adam. Sam, do you want to speak next?
Yeah, sure. Hey guys, my name is Sam. I use he, him pronouns. I'm on the Environmental Justice Subcommittee in BSAC, and I'm also one of the general coordinators on the Boston Climate Strike team. When I started organizing, it wasn't really around climate advocacy, but I moved into climate advocacy because I realized how interconnected it is and how everyone is affected by the climate crisis. And when I started working on the Green New Deal, what I realized is that the Green New Deal is also, it's extremely interconnected because of the 3 pillars that it has. It affects so many different people from so many different walks of life. And not only does it affect those people, it's going to help those people. And I think that it's extremely important, not only that it helps fix our climate crisis, but also reworks the way our democracy functions. And so I think that's what's most exciting, how it, reworks how we function as a society.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. Simon, do you want to take it away?
Sure. What's going on, everybody? My name is Simon. I'm a high school student. I'm a junior at Boston Land Academy, member of the Boston Student Advisory Council and Youth on Board. So I have been lucky and blessed enough to be a part of the Massachusetts Green New Deal table for the past year since it started as a young person, which has really been, like Adam was saying, interesting, scary. It's been a lot of experiences, but it's been, I'd say the number one word that comes to my head is powerful. Like we've had so much power being able to work cross different, from labor unions to environmental justice organizations from all across the state. It's been like really empowering as a young person to be able to sit at a table, with all these different groups of people. And like we've actually made a lot of progress this past year, and unfortunately this whole coronavirus situation has kind of made us take a little left turn and try and see how we can help the more current and obvious situation that's at hand. But it's just been really great. Like we held our first coalition meeting where we gathered like many people. I think there was like 67, someone can tell there was a lot of people at that meeting from every single coalition, and we were able to like have really deep, like a 2-3 hour conversation diving down into like the many ways the Green New Deal is intersectionally affecting all different groups of people, and how we can work together to make it prosper and work very well in Massachusetts as a state, which is a little different than as a nation, only because as a state, it gives you more like priorities and like specifics to like what our state may need and what our state may benefit from, different from the nation as a whole. And I think it's another positive of it is it allows us to look at it in like a microscope level. So like the issues that labor unions may be facing in Massachusetts may be a lot different than like South Carolina, because like who knows what the labor is like down there. So it makes the situation like more more zoomed in, and as well it makes the outcome to be a lot more powerful and successful because we're doing it at more of a local level. So yeah, that's my take.
Thank you, Simon. And Wellington, do you want to share your experience now?
My experiences with working on the Massachusetts Green New Deal has been very cool, very productive, especially since there's youth on the team and we're giving our input. We are basically working on how we want to live our future and what we want it to look like, which is just very cool, and how like the adults kind of build a space for like the youth to like pitch in and bring in their ideas and also speak on like what's on their mind, which kind of like helps build productivity on the work we do. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Thank you, Wellington. Yeah, and I just really want to like back up what all of our BSAC members have said in saying that I think this coalition is really different in that it's really experimental to have all of these different groups coming together and work in a really intersectional kind of way. You know, historically, like environmental justice groups and youth groups and labor unions, and then like more traditional climate focused orgs have been tackling climate change on their own, and you know, interfacing with their communities and their constituents, but creating spaces in which these different groups can come together and have deep and honest discussions, and talk about how we can build power together collectively and address all of our respective needs in a really like symbiotic, comprehensive kind of way is new, and it's different, and it's exciting, and it's also it's scary, and it's tough, messy work a lot of the time, but it has been incredibly inspiring to see all of these different groups come together and break bread together and listen and learn in a really productive, generative kind of way. And, you know, we're looking forward to continuing this work. And like Simon said, you know, we're incorporating what's happening now around COVID into shaping, you know, what our package of solutions, our policy proposals actually look like. And we look forward to having ongoing conversations with some of the folks who are on this call to shape what this proposal actually ends up looking like.
Yeah, I just to quickly add on, I 100% agree. I also feel like within the different sectors, I feel like there are already generalized perceptions or stereotypes within these different communities that we work with. So I feel like it's really awesome to really dismantle that. Like, for example, young people are seen as not knowledgeable or don't have the wisdom or the life experience in order to facilitate these conversations and be involved in the legislation to change these things. And it's really cool to be a part of that change and sort of dismantling those perceptions and like prove to other people like the people necessary in these conversations have every right and have all of the intelligence necessary to move things and change things and make things more inclusive for other people. And it sort of like sets the boundary, sets the expectation for every other social justice project that we would ever work on, both at a state and national level, and make sure that everyone is included in the conversation in order to support that. So yeah, just to add on to that. And yeah, I will hand it off to Nick or Ella to go back into the presentation.
Amazing. Cool. Thanks so much, Tyler, Aria. Thanks so much for everyone from BSAC So cool. It's so important to build these connections and get this visibility and yeah, really work on meaningful things. Okay, so we are at, yeah, it's almost 1:30. So this is a pretty good time for a Q&A. So in the Zoom webinar thing, if you look sort of at the bottom of your screen, there's like a little, like, oh, there's a chat bubble on the left. Oh, there's like a chat bubble on the right that says Q&A. Feel free to throw some questions over there and we'll try our best to answer them. All right, we have a question.
So I think one of the questions
Go for it, Tyler.
is, where are the young women in this student movement? I can tell you they are alive, they are in our movement, and they are, especially on BSAC. It's just a matter of who was able to make the presentation today. But we have many young women who are helping to lead this movement from the youth perspective. And I think some of them are actually participating as attendees on the call right now. Yeah, I don't know if you want to also chime in on that, Aria, as well.
Yes, so the Boston Student Advisory Council has a lot of women representation. We also make sure that we discuss a lot of the social justice issues like sexism and racism and how that's always included in the conversation. So we definitely value and we make sure that there are young women within all of the movements and all of the projects that we push forward. So that is a very good question. And I like the question. I like the fact that the question was asked.
Absolutely. We got a question from Carol that is, will you send us the slides afterwards, particularly about the Green New Deal? Yes, we will. If you signed up through that RSVP link, we have your email address, so I think we're going to send them out that way. Great question. Thank you for the questions. Also, these don't have to be you know, really hard hitting, like, I thought about this question for weeks, now is my chance. Just like, ask us anything. What's it like to be us? How are we doing? Okay. Ooh, this is a good one from Joel. What do you think? Does anyone have a good answer for this one?
Yeah, I think
Go for it.
yeah, so Joel's question was that he's concerned about a focus on top-down legislative change and pushing for federal legislation. And I think that is a legitimate concern. I think this is a matter of both and. You know, we are pushing for comprehensive legislation at the federal level because we know that the scale and speed at which change will need to occur across all sectors of our economy has to happen in a really orchestrated way that is obviously just and that centers the needs of working class communities and communities of color first and foremost. But we know that it's going to have to happen rapidly if we want to avoid the worst impacts of what climate change has in store for us. So, you know, we are at the same time building power and building a broad base of people who are going to be able to push for change at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. We also need, we need to be pushing for change that happens, that can mobilize the kind of fundamental transformations that we know are necessary because we dawdled and because we waited and because ExxonMobil funded millions and millions of dollars of disinformation for the last 30 years to prevent any meaningful change from happening. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on it, but other folks can obviously chime in.
Yeah, it's I mean, it can be partially tough, right? Because a lot of the reason these neoliberal, oh, we got a lot of questions, so I'll be quick. A lot of the reasons these neoliberal things keep going is because, sort of like Tyler said, a lot of the times our representatives aren't really advocating for us. So the more pressure we put on the actual policy levers and avenues of advocacy we actually have, we can try to mitigate that for sure. Good question. Let's see. My gosh, Natasha's asking, where are all the men? Come on, guys, we got to do a better job. For sure, for sure. Cora asks about, do you know anything about a potential seawall protecting Boston from rising ocean levels that would be involved with the Massachusetts Green New Deal?
We aren't at the point in our conversation internally within the roundtable where we're discussing those kinds of really like tangible, localized solutions quite yet. I think, like Simon said, we've had essentially one mass coalition meeting so far. We're holding another one next week, and we are focused on deepening the relationships across our sectors to like Aria's point, kind of challenge and dismantle some of the barriers to really full cooperation and collaboration that kind of mar these intersectional kinds of coalitions. And we aren't really at the point where we're proposing those kinds of tangible pieces of action quite yet, but I'm sure that those kinds of conversations will happen moving forward in our coalition, and it'll be interesting to see the different kinds of solutions that different communities propose based on what they're experiencing locally. But I'll also add that the coalition is meant to represent the interests of the entire state, not just Boston, and bringing in Western Mass, bringing in Worcester, bringing in Springfield, bringing in the coast communities. Like, this is an important focus of our work together, is to decenter Boston as being the focus and locus of change in our work together.
Cool. How about one more? Does anyone have a question they feel particularly passionate to answer?
I mean, there's the simple one of, from Coco, how old are all of you?
I think that's actually a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm 18.
I am 26.
I'm
20. Oh. Sorry.
I'm 16.
I
I'm
just turned
16.
19. Oh, geez.
I'm
Wellington,
16.
you go first.
Yeah, I'm 16.
I just turned 19.
Sam, how old are you?
I'm 16.
16. I'm 26 as well.
I'm 20.
So yeah, we span a spectrum of ages, but I mean, like, it's funny as we sort of like get back to the rest of the presentation. It's interesting that we are able to sort of like make these, even though a lot of us are kind of in the same generation, but still cross subsections of the generation coalitions where we can work together really effectively. Yeah.
All right, so I can take us to the last section, and I think some of these questions will also fold in to this part. So let me do that. Great. So the last part is why movements. We've talked a lot about what the Green New Deal is and learned about more about the state of the Green New Deal in Massachusetts and the work that's happening on the ground to make a Green New Deal for Massachusetts. And now we're going to talk about sort of how we get it done. And there are a lot of different theories, obviously, about how we achieve social change. And so for example, like some will say, power comes from the top down. We need to have politicians sort of working the inside game for us and making sure that they're fighting for the Green New Deal in Congress. Others say change starts by modeling a better world in our own lives or by transforming our schools, our communities, and our workplaces. Still others turn to mass protests. And the truth is there's no one theory of change that's gonna bring about a Green New Deal. It's really, really crucial that we don't lose sight of the fact that we need all of these things together. Like Tyler said earlier, we need both top down and bottom up. We need all these different strategies, and we need people working on a local level. We need people working on a state level, on a federal level. We need all of these things in order to really bring about the societal change. Yeah, so this is something that I've taken from Momentum, which is sort of this sort of movement incubator that a bunch of different organizations have come out of, including Sunrise, including the Cosecha movement, and If Not Now. And it takes it sort of a look at where power comes from in our political system. So the way they see it is there are two views of power, the monolithic and the social. So the monolithic view is power comes from the top down. There's like, for example, if you see in this chart, like you see a politician, someone at the top who has a lot of power and is sort of ruling over a large amount of people. And then the social view of power is actually looking at the people who make up the rest of this pyramid, saying that, okay, wait, there are so many more people in the bottom than in this top, and surely with the larger amount of people, like we can cause change from the bottom up. And this is the view of power, the social view of power that we really focus on at Sunrise. And then there's this sort of like silly comic, but I really like this because it's really just reframing who has power in our system. Like looking at politicians and how, like, okay, we actually are the ones that elect politicians, and we have so much power. Like if we all get organized and actually use our power, like we can topple politicians, we can elect new ones, and returning our view of power to people. And this is really important for the Green New Deal. If we look at where we are now, it's clear that if we sit and wait for our representatives in the State House and in the halls of Congress to enact a Green New Deal, it's not going to happen. But by focusing on the power, by focusing only on the power that politicians hold and just sort of waiting for them to accomplish this, we're missing a big part of the picture, and that is people. So how many people does it take exactly? There is this amazing study by Erica Chenoweth, who's a sociologist, and she put forth this study about a couple of years ago that is looking at nonviolent social campaigns in different parts of the world, a really comprehensive study of all social campaigns since 1900. And she sort of came upon this magic number that is 3.5%. And 3.5% is saying that there has been no nonviolent social campaign or movement in the last about 100 years that has succeeded. When they mobilize 3.5% of the general population in active, sustained support, when they're able to do that, none of them have failed to achieve their goals. That's huge. That's really, really exciting, and is obviously like simplifying the situation. But like we look at the statistic in Sunrise and look at what it would really mean to engage 3.5% of our population in active, sustained support. So up until, I would say, about 6 weeks ago, this was really clear. We are working towards climate strikes. We're working towards a massive youth uprising. We're working towards massive amounts of people in very small spaces, sharing the same air, touching each other, breathing in very small spaces. And that's really the elephant in the room right now. We cannot do that. In this moment of coronavirus, obviously, big rallies are not able to happen anymore. And it's caused this massive moment of reckoning. Because at the same time, like at the same time that a bunch of the ways that like organizing has been conceived of, like have sort of been rendered like ineffective, or just like we're not able to use them anymore by coronavirus. We're also facing this massive trigger moment, like the biggest trigger moment of our lifetimes, in which things that seemed like they would never be politically possible all of a sudden are. We're seeing the government spend these huge amounts of money on these bailout packages. We're seeing the implementation of stimulus checks, all these things. And in this moment, we're seeing that just sort of society has really been cracked open. We're seeing that all these social inequalities are now at like impossible to ignore at the forefront of society, and we're really seeing the failures of the system really come to a head. So this is a sort of question that like movements are now grappling with, is how or like what does active sustained participation look like under COVID-19? And I would love for people to like just offer some thoughts in the chat. I know this is something that's been on a lot of our minds. I liked Marion had a question earlier that was, what do you folks do to keep focused and uplifted during these times? How do you sustain this work? And that was a question I really liked, because again, like we're having to be really creative. We're having to really, it's been a big paradigm shift. And for me, like one of the things that active sustained participation looks like is community building, is Zoom calls like this, like being able to just see other people's faces, being able to engage in discussions and see the work that we're doing together. That's something that's really been helping me to sustain this work. So yeah, I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on what we can do. This teach-in is a big example of active sustained participation under COVID-19. Yeah, continuing to build community virtually, seeing ourselves and our lives as interconnected. Absolutely. Mutual aid is huge. Yeah. Contacting representatives. Absolutely, pushing lawmakers through letters and virtually. This is a big point of the power hours we're doing throughout the day. Socially distanced protests in strategic locations. Yeah, I've seen a couple of these, and that's been really cool to see. Phone banking, sending emails to reps and senators, petitions, doing research in our free time. Absolutely. So like, as you can see, there are a lot of ways to be engaged, and like, it definitely takes some shifting. It's definitely really hard to just reframe everything we've been working on. But it's been really, for me, it's been really inspiring just to see the ways that people have creatively come forward in this moment. I was just seeing Sunrise Bay Area had some really incredible protests. They've been doing banner drops. I think in Philly as well. They've been doing banner drops from houses. They've been painting stencils on sidewalks with messages. They were holding banners, like two people on each side, like being socially distant, on top of the freeway. And yeah, like there are a ton of ways that we can sort of make use of this moment, and at the same time, like we need to, because there's in this moment like so much is changing, so much is happening, and it's going to be a real defining moment of whether or not this crisis turns into an opportunity for corporations to profit and to be bailed out, or whether this opportunity turns into the start of a progressive era. Yeah. And so while a lot of the means of how we're protesting, how we're organizing are changing, the demands are also changing, and they need to, because we're in a moment where, like, obviously people are really struggling to fulfill basic needs, and the political landscape has changed really quickly. So Sunrise is a part of many other organizations that have signed on to the People's Bailout, and this is something that we're advocating for. And similar to the Green New Deal, the People's Bailout is not about a single bill. It's not about a single demand. It's about setting forth like a set of values, a set of like a new political common sense through which to define this era. It's setting like these values so that when new issues and situations arise, like we have sort of the groundwork to address them and just a common set of values to unite behind. So these are rescuing workers and communities above corporate executives. They're making health the top priority for all people without exceptions, providing economic relief directly to the people, making a down payment on a regenerative economy while preventing future crises, and lastly, protecting our democratic process while protecting each other. And I would really recommend if you go to thepeoplesbailout.org, you can find more information on this. It's something that we're folding into as like in our organizing towards the Green New Deal, seeing this as a crucial moment to really stand in solidarity with working people and to make sure that these demands are met, because we know that winning a Green New Deal is not just about getting to renewable energy. It's not about these things. It's about working towards a whole new political alignment in which we actually value people. And this is a part of that. All this work is connected. Yeah, so in this moment of crisis, we need to turn to our community for support. And we're seeing that with a lot of mutual aid networks, with calls, with spaces like this. And I wanted to just end with this beautiful slide that Nick made. I don't know, maybe Nick, you want to walk us through this, but I really love this, and just thinking through how the work we're doing now is bringing us together and bringing us into this new era.
Yeah, no, you can go for it, Ella.
Oh, okay. I love this. Yeah, so when we organize, we build connections. And as we reach new communities, we're able to learn, grow, and share with each other. So eventually we may realize our organizing built a crucial safety net. I think this is really, really important in this moment. Like just the work that we do, I mean, obviously something like coronavirus, we never could have anticipated these situations that are arising, but the work of organizing is connecting us all, bringing us together and making sure that when crisis arises, we have this network to fall on. We have, even when like some connections break apart, even like when it's put under a lot of stress, we've built these networks through which to reach out to people and make sure that we have resilient communities going forward into these crises. All right. So yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us. Please stick around for the next couple workshops. And I'm going to pass it off to who's doing this last power hour.
I
Is that
can
Tyler?
take the lead on it. And if
Cool.
also, Sam, you'd like to chime in, you're obviously welcome to. But, oh, Ella, I don't have remote control of your screen anymore. But if you just want to move it on. Perfect. So for the next power hour, before the next workshop gets started at 2, we're going to be supporting Boston Climate Strike Team's COVID-19 relief demands. And specifically, if you live in Massachusetts, we're going to be asking that you call and email your state senator about the COVID-19 demands that the BCS team has released, and ask them to sign on and support some key pieces of legislation that are going to provide much needed relief to working people across the state. So I'm going to drop this link into the chat for everyone, and it's going to take you to a Google form where you're going to see some information on how you can get in touch with your state senator, how to figure out who your state senator is if you don't know who they are. And then it'll provide you with some really straightforward scripts on what to say if you're giving your senator's office a call, or what to include in an email. If you'd prefer to pass along an email to them, you can do both. And then it will provide you with some information on the pieces of legislation that the BCS team is calling for around COVID-19 relief. And I will move us to the next screen where you will, where we have some more information on some of the bills. So there are 4 key bills that the BCS team is pushing for. So the first is having additional pay for essential workers whose jobs are necessary during the COVID-19 crisis and beyond the COVID-19 crisis. So enabling hazard pay for frontline workers who continue to show up each and every day to make sure that we're taken care of, that we're safe. The next bill is a quarantine assistance fund to provide financial assistance to those who are temporarily or permanently unemployed due to COVID-19. The third piece of legislation is emergency funding for our regional transit authorities to ensure that public transportation continues to provide a lifeline for communities across the state, not just in Boston. And then the last piece of legislation that the BCS team is calling for is a review of all pretrial detentions to decarcerate anyone who poses no physical threat to their community, including those who have been charged with possession of controlled substances within 14 days. So the link is in the chat, and you'll get more information when you go to it about how to figure out who your senator is, how to contact your state senator, and some really easy scripts to give them a call or send them an email where you can incorporate some of your own personal experiences, why it's important to you, what matters. If you're familiar with the bill, you can include what your specific connections are to those pieces of legislation and why they matter to you. And if you'd like, you can go ahead and put a + sign into the chat to indicate that you've already completed the action for this power hour. And also, if you have any questions, we're here. We're going to be sticking around until 2 to answer those for you. They can be related to this power hour. They can be related to anything else as well.
And Tyler, as we're wrapping up, I'm going to drop one additional link in the chat that I've been asked to share. If anyone is interested in getting involved during these times and coming to a virtual Sunrise Boston meeting, we threw a form down there. How would any young people potentially interested in joining BSAC look to get involved or be part of the Massachusetts Green New Deal Roundtable?
So if you're interested in getting involved in BSAC, most high schools in the Boston area have one or more representatives who serve on Boston Student Advisory Council. So you can either get in touch with your BSAC representative who comes from your high school, or you can get in touch with me or Aria directly. We can go ahead and drop our email into the chat so that you can have our contact information.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, also as we're wrapping up, there's some questions going out for folks who kind of want to hang on to this info and stuff that's been going on in the chat. Not entirely sure the chat can be saved on the attendee side. I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think as part of the attendee package, you just can't do that. But I think our folks are saving the chat and can maybe send that out somehow when we send stuff to people. Aha. We just heard that we have the chat saved and can send it. Amazing.
And just one more time, dropping the link to the Boston Climate Strike Team's COVID-19 relief demands into the chat. If you haven't already had a chance to do so, please go to the link where you're going to learn more information about how to contact your state senator if you're a Massachusetts resident, and the specific demands that we're calling for around COVID-19 relief. If you don't have time to do this now, you're obviously more than welcome to save the link and complete it at a later time. We also are definitely encouraging you to pass along that link to any other Massachusetts residents who would be interested in contacting their state senators. You do not have to be 18 to contact your state senator. You don't have to be voting age. They represent your interests whether or not you are over or under 18. And you have the right to demand they listen to you as your representative in our state Senate. So please feel free to copy the link, share the link, and take part in this super important action so that we can ensure that communities across the state are really benefiting from relief and stimulus packages, and that the benefits are not being consolidated by corporate interests.
And I just want to quickly plug the Boston Climate Strike Twitter storm again. I'm going to drop the link again to the Twitter scripts and some information on the bills that we're pushing for. This isn't all the bills and our demands, but it is the ones we chose to focus on for today. And yeah, we're just targeting Speaker DeLeo and Senate President Spilka. And yeah, it should be pretty good.
Cool. So I think this is probably a good time that we'll start transitioning out. So I don't know if anyone else wants to go off mute and say anything before we go. Just want to say thanks so much for logging by and listening to us talk.
Yes, thank you so much for staying for the entire 2 hours and staying engaged and really being involved in all the conversations. I really appreciate it. We all really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone. Happy Earth Day. I hope you stick around for more of the trainings. There's sunrise training on Massachusetts state politics coming up right after this, and some really exciting opportunities later in the day, including a virtual rally with our state senator, Ed Markey, father of the Green New Deal. And thank you again to everyone for engaging in the conversation today.